Federal funding can make or break an infrastructure project, but what happens when the rules change overnight? This week, I'm joined by Chris Livingstone, a seasoned expert in infrastructure finance and transaction structuring with nearly 25 years of experience shaping major projects like the Washington Union Station expansion and helping agencies like LA Metro navigate the complexities of funding, financial modeling, and public-private partnerships. Chris isn't just advising on mega deals, he's also demystifying the challenges of delivering infrastructure through his weekly video series, offering insights into what it takes to get projects built. Today, we're diving into how shifting federal policies are reshaping project funding, what agencies can do to stay ahead, and whether we're entering a new era of infrastructure investment or uncertainty. I'm Kate Gasparo, and this is Building Better Cities. So, you've worked with a lot of public agencies and some private interests. Can you talk about why is the federal government involved with infrastructure development and even more broadly, real estate and infrastructure development?
Yeah, well, fundamentally, the role of the federal government is really to provide funding. Right now, the incorporation of federal funding to the project itself is essentially free money, is a great addition to making any project financially feasible. And then you might have to add in, if you're talking about P3, then you might add in, debt and equity and other forms as well. But the federal funding element creates this solid base on which to build the funding and financing structure. And that's what's been such an important component of getting projects moving.
Yeah.
Now, there are some downsides. Depending on your viewpoint, they can be downsides or upsides, but they are constraints or limitations, right? There's requirements that come with the dollars that you get from the federal government. But on balance, I think most projects would say we will accept those limitations or the compliance requirements in order to receive the money.
Yeah. Why should a project even need money? Why can't a project just work by itself?
Well, the answer is that some of them can, right? Some of them can, but it depends on the asset class. And now, if you're talking about airports, right? Airports have pretty solid revenue bases. They generate revenue from airlines, they generate revenue from passengers, they generate revenue from concessions and parking. They have multiple sources of funding. But if you look at the previous round of IIJA funding, airports still needed a sort of boost in terms of being able to move their capital projects forward. So what we see is that a lot of these public projects, especially when you're talking about large capital investments, they're really hard to get off the ground simply by bringing just debt and equity because the quantum is too high and the revenues don't match sort of the repayment. So you need to sort of mitigate the cost of debt and equity a little bit through the usage of funding.
And what's the scale of a project where it makes sense to go and seek federal resources?
Well, I don't know if there's really an upper or lower limit. We see, like, for example, with RAISE grants, that the maximum of those grant values is $25 million, which is not considered a lot of money in the project world, but they can still get very meaningful projects built. So I would say that it's all relative, right? It's relative between the size of the project, the benefits that are likely to accrue from that project, and the cost of it. And that's actually fundamentally why you need to do a benefit cost analysis to sort of determine what that ratio is, right?
You spoke a little bit about the strings that are attached to these dollars,
Yeah.
and those could be quantified as costs. Is there a dollar amount where it makes sense that any agency should go after these resources given the strings? Or is it really only the sophisticated agencies that have this internal infrastructure where it makes sense that they can go after any dollar amount?
Well, I think there's two questions in there. The first one, I would say, with the limitations, are you talking about things like prevailing wage or domestic content, right? Actually, a lot of these agencies are already paying prevailing wage, so they may well comply. And then things like domestic content for sort of run-of-the-mill construction projects, like, let's say I'm building a city hall or something, domestic content was probably fairly easy to comply with too, although there may be a cost element to it, a cost increase. When you're talking about things that are a little more exotic, and a good example of that is a high-speed rail system, it actually might be difficult to comply with domestic content requirements because we don't really have a high-speed manufacturing industry in this country. And
Mm-hmm.
so, that presents more of a challenge, right, in order to actually comply. So that's the first thing. The second thing is what kind of agency can apply. Really, it's certainly true that the bigger agencies have more resources. They can hire consultants.
Mm-hmm.
They can hire lobbyists to advocate for their particular grant funding and all the rest of it. Smaller governmental entities may find it difficult to comply with some of the more onerous rules around the actual grant compliance and the application. On the current administration, because we're in this somewhat sort of freeze of many of these programs, and we're not quite sure how these programs are going to migrate to new programs or new opportunities. But in the previous administration, they were quite open and helpful in being a resource to smaller agencies to help them apply successfully.
Okay. I just want to go back because you said domestic content, and I
Mm-hmm.
assume that's the Buy America policy in
Right.
which goods should be manufactured in America if the project is being financed or funded in some part by the federal government.
That's right.
Um, and then I know this is probably why a lot of listeners will tune in is to talk about the shift between administrations, the administration that relied on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which had a large
Correct.
infrastructure component to it.
Yes, it did.
So between those two bills that passed during the Biden administration, there's a lot of resources that went out the door to support infrastructure at a lot
Mm-hmm.
of different scales. Now, this administration started off within its first couple of weeks to first freeze and then rescind
Yep.
freezing grants and loans. So I just sort of want to open it up because this is a very different style. And maybe it hasn't been solidified what the Trump administration will do as it pertains to infrastructure financing and funding. And
Yep.
maybe you can talk about how you're seeing this play out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think when the Biden administration was in, it was fairly clear what their goals were. Their policies sort of shone through their funding through the IIJA and the IRA, which was primarily, increased public transportation, equitable access, and provisions to address climate change. We've heard in the new administration, I think, some clear policy about some of those things, particularly around maybe climate change and then maybe equitable access. But we haven't necessarily seen that flow out into the funding at this point in time. So I think it's fair to say that everyone's, and this doesn't go just for federal funding, it goes for a lot of federal policy and the ultimate outcomes of where we are. Is if you think about maybe some of these administrations' policies, thinking about potentially public governments behaving in a more business-like manner, being more efficient and all the rest of it, then that sort of tends to look toward more structure that has a business component to it, right? Ports, airports, toll roads, all of that, all of those elements have private investment incorporated into them, and they are revenue generators
Mm-hmm.
versus things like public transit, for example, which in some cases is a revenue generator, but not always cash flow positive.
Hmm.
So I tend to think that I'm just crystal ball gazing, but if I was to look 12, 24 months into the future, I would think if we were to preserve the federal funding structure for infrastructure, that those types of business orientated assets would likely be the winners.
Okay. And it seems that you're saying business oriented in the sense that there's direct revenue from the asset itself, that
Correct.
there's some
Yeah.
sort of toll or fee or rent that is being paid to the entity that is constructing the asset.
Right.
Now, there's one school of thought where, building infrastructure has a lot of indirect benefits.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to capture revenue from indirect benefits could be seen, I don't know if you're thinking as a similar business case to be made.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I'm not
Mm-hmm.
sure that viewpoint is shared. And if you look at, for example, public transportation, I live in Los Angeles, the traffic gets worse and worse every year. You could argue that there would be a significant economic benefit, disregarding the environmental and social benefit for a moment, to an enhanced public transportation system. People can get to work quicker, which means they can be more productive. People can get around the city quicker, which means they can be spending money in parts of the city where they would not normally do it, to take two examples. I'm not sure that philosophy or sort of rationale necessarily is going to flow for the next 4 years.
That's fair. So I want to talk a little bit about your clients, clients that you've worked with, those that were able to receive funding beforehand, before January 21st, where the whole world
Right.
changed. How are they feeling about the security of the funds that have been dedicated towards their projects from the federal government? And then is there a different mindset based off of what point in time that project is or where that funding agreement is at with the federal government as this new administration has stepped into power?
I think there is definitely a good amount of concern about projects in the system, particularly with clients who have been awarded federal funds but not necessarily received them, or in midstream for receiving them. You know, there have been times when systems have been shut off, right? And people have been essentially shut out of systems. So they're like, I don't know what's going on anymore. What we have always counseled our clients to do is be 100% compliant, right? Don't get dinged on a technicality where they can turn around and say, you were non-compliant, you've breached the terms of your grant agreement, and now we're taking the money back. So we do a lot of work with our clients to essentially get them to that 100% compliance. It might not solve all their problems. Ultimately, that might, not prove to be 100% effective, right?
Yeah.
But at least it's them taking an action step to do everything they can do to preserve those funds.
Let's just say I'm LA Metro, right? And
Okay.
I'm about to break ground and I've been guaranteed a construction loan from the federal government.
Yep.
Should I be concerned about where we're at right now?
I think you should be concerned because if you haven't got the funds in your account, the federal government operates on a reimbursement basis. So
Sure.
they don't just drop $100 million into your account. They reimburse you for costs that you have incurred. You have to very carefully plan your cash outlay. So now what you're saying is month one, I'm going to spend $5 million. I'm going to LA Metro, I'm going to write the check, right?
Sure.
And then I'm going to get my paperwork together and I'm going to submit it to the federal government and they're going to reimburse me for the appropriate amount of that. Now, that's all good, right? If you can manage your cash flow. But what happens when the spigot gets turned off is suddenly you're in a cash flow issue and you may have a contract, right, with your contractor. Now, are you going to turn that contract off or delay it or, terminate or whatever it's going to be? It's likely to be some type of either schedule or financial impact to that. Because we are still existing in this state of somewhat unknowing, there's this current ever-present risk that might happen. And I think we're sort of seeing, in some respects, that hesitancy rippling through.
And say, this agency doesn't have $5 million in cash and they're using a bridging loan.
Right.
Is that lender now concerned as well?
Yeah, I mean, the implications ripple outwards.
Out.
They can certainly move into problematic territory, which it ultimately wants to do. So all agencies do a lot of work to understand their cash flow position, look forward in time and really manage their cash.
And because the federal resources are really, as you said at the beginning of the episode, a catalyst to bring in other types of funding, what is the portion of funds or resources that the federal government is providing versus your other funding and financing streams?
Some federal programs can go up to an 80-20 match, right? So 80% federal funds. It's more common to be around the 50-50 mark. But when you think of that, that's sort of a double-edged sword, right? It's great if you get the money, but if you don't get the money, it presents a significant risk to project delivery and schedule and all the rest of it. Now, if you're talking about an alternative delivery variant, then you're likely to be having multiple sources of funding, right? And it's a bit like a house of cards or a set of dominoes or whatever analogy you want to use, but
Yeah.
removing one of them will fundamentally disrupt all of them.
Yeah.
So I think agencies are really having to carefully think about the risks that presents right now.
Right. And, one of the traits of Trump with his real estate dynasty is that at heart, he's a builder, right?
Yeah.
So he
Mm-hmm.
wants to build assets, whether that's real estate or infrastructure. And it seemed like Infrastructure Week existed for the entire reign of his first stint as president. So
Yep.
I'm curious, even though this time right now might seem a little tentative or tumultuous, do you see that there's a pathway to getting more stability at a federal level around policy that these projects have more confidence to move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're moving slowly towards is, clarity around the structure bill, which is likely to be part of a bigger one. If that is the case, that's still an unknown, but I think we're likely to see that policy sort of come out in the form of a new set of funding. All the old stuff that we knew, or a good portion of it, which we became familiar with over the last 4 years, is going to go away. But the one thing I will say is there's certainly a heightened focus on efficiency, on economy. And so I don't think we're going to see this generational infrastructure investment boom that we previously experienced. I think it's likely to be a pretty slimmed down, targeted version. So just a focus on a few projects that can actually be delivered, rather than a sort of scattergun approach of tons and tons of projects that may or may not get delivered. So I think it's going to be more like mission critical projects, mission critical infrastructure. And again, going back to what I first said, this is likely to be around enhancing trade and business, I would have thought, as a priority for this administration.
Sure. One thing I remember is him standing on stage shortly after the 2016 election. He's inaugurated with this humongous paper for NEPA and environmental clearance that
Yeah.
projects had to go through, and the regulatory hurdles and red tape that projects that receive federal funding or even at a state level receive public dollars need to go through to be able to break ground.
Yeah.
Is that something you think will be a focus of this 4 years as well?
Oh, for sure. I mean, we just have to look here in California at the wildfires, right? And actually, to be fair, they've waived a lot of those requirements as they quickly mobilize to clear the debris and then shore up the place and then rebuild. There was a general consensus that the environmental permitting process was broken. I give you an example. I worked on a project last year that was in the environmental permitting process for 9 years, right? And people look at that and they go, why? What takes so long? And does the ultimate document sort of prove that it was worth it? And I think there's certainly a strong contingent that says no, it's not. So I think there was general consensus that something had to change, right? And not sure we were really getting to a really good, solution about what that change should be. But I think what we're ultimately going to see is that a lot of this stuff, particularly around NEPA, not necessarily CEQA in California, which is the California version of the environmental permitting process, that's going to maybe go away. It's going to get significantly reduced. It's going to the requirements are going to reduce. Now, I think with all of these policy changes, something that often gets lost is the nuance, right? Is the gray area.
Right.
Because there is a purpose to ensuring that we're not riding roughshod over our environment as we deliver new projects. That, to me, that's very, very important. But there's also the other side of that, which suggests that if we're going to build something, there should be a way we could get to agreement on it, assess the sort of the outcomes, the likely impacts, and then move on. So I don't think I've got the solution to that, but I think those are the issues that we're trying to contend with, both sides. And I think somewhere or other, we've just got wrapped around our axle in bureaucracy, basically.
We've mostly been talking about planned projects that have been on a capital planning book for the last few years, at least. And there's been a lot of thought and energy that's gone into how these projects are put together, designed, and how the capital stack is going to be created. In times of disasters, and we're going to talk about climate disasters, there's a need to pull together infrastructure plans and projects quickly so that communities can rebuild, move on. And we saw this in LA, is that the state and local governments are very much still reliant on the federal government to help secure funding for immediate emergency needs and then these long-term rebuilding efforts. How do you see the federal government addressing these urgent emergency projects as opposed to the ones that have been on the planning books for quite some time?
Well, there is a pretty well-established source of funding and mobilization, primarily through FEMA for emergency funding, and then also potentially through the state as well. Resnick does a lot of that work. We did everything from Hurricane Sandy, Katrina, all the way through. We're currently still working on the North Carolina emergency that occurred a few months back, and various other things. And we will essentially stand up teams to support FEMA in deploying. Primarily, we're helping deployment of funds to the right people and the right entities. So they do have these mechanisms are in place. Again, it's a bit like the environmental permitting conundrum, is that, are they being deployed efficiently? Are they reaching the right people? Is this the right way to go about doing it? Yeah. And I know that there are certain plans in place to change FEMA or take it away altogether. Maybe fairly well known entities are now sort of in this state of existential crisis, or certainly having a threat posed to them. Emergencies are always tough. They always, particularly around climate emergencies, get bad press generally if you write about the way they get handled. Yeah. In reality, it's very difficult to mobilize quickly to contend with what is always a unique set of circumstances, right? Because you might be regionally unique. The people involved might have unique needs or requirements. So it's very difficult to do that. And I think most people would expect that some type of a federal emergency department would still exist to help people out in these type of situations.
Yeah. I can only think that between a constrained supply chain to rebuild and also the tariffs that we're seeing being imposed on incoming goods, construction goods, thinking about steel and other large construction needs, the cost for building could increase. I want to say it will inevitably increase.
Will increase.
Will increase. And, in part, this is the federal government, and they've been warning us about this, that there will be some pain going through these larger policy shifts. Do you see that they will, on the back end, be able to support projects and where they are seeing construction costs increase to sort of subsidize that cost? Or because this administration's very business market focused, they will wait till things settle down and even out themselves?
Well, I would say, and this is just my own observation, that the increasing cost is always running ahead of people's expectation of cost, right? And what that means is, particularly in inflationary environments, but even in environments like the long-term average, 30-year average for inflation is 2.5%. Now, every year we delay, $100 million project is $102 $0.5 million, or in an
Mm-hmm.
inflationary environment, $108 million. And that gets compounded. So we delay 2-3 years and we're up to $130 million. So I've seen this on projects. I had a project a few years ago, which was a streetcar project. We had an estimate done and we went for federal funding for small starts, and we sort of put a package of local funding. We had measured dollars as well. And by the time we got through that process, we got the estimate redone, and it was more than the money that we had, right? So now we're
Yeah.
like back to the drawing board,
Wow.
like we've now got a funding gap again. And this is the eternal conundrum with public projects. It takes a long time to get, particularly big ones, right? A long time to assemble the funds, a
Yes.
long time to get the stakeholder buy-in, which is essential. It can be subject to political, headwinds, and so that can just slow projects down. And at the moment you think you've got a financially feasible project based on what you had before, it's no longer feasible. So it happens all the time. I'm not sure there's really a solution to that, except you need a strong political champion who can drive the project forward and advocate for its benefits,
Mm-hmm.
and convince people that paying another 10% on the original price is still worth it.
Yeah. I want to hear a little bit into your thought process when you are working with agencies, whether that's on an emergency basis or on a planned project, and there are all these dynamics on a political scale. I know you said a little bit that this is a wait and see moment, but for projects, waiting is dollars, to your point. And
Yeah.
how long are you willing to wait or advise them to wait for all of this to come together?
Well, it somewhat depends on where they are in the project development cycle, right? How exposed they are to federal funding or local funding and all the rest of it. I think we have to be realistic and say that it's regionally based as well, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
state by state. If we're in California, we're taking assessment of funding federal dollars, which is going to be fairly conservative because we might not expect to receive those dollars. If you're somewhere else, you
Yeah.
might be expectant to get more. So I think you have to be very practical. There's no point in burying your head in the sand. I think you have to put contingency plans in place. Project development really contains a few fundamentals. As I said, finding a political champion, very important. Getting broad stakeholder buy-in for the benefits and the investment, very important. Reaching financial feasibility, very important. So I think you sort of focus on the elements of that you can control. And then, you have to, if possible, put contingencies in place. If you're a project that was going to rely on 50% federal funding and suddenly you don't have that, you are now in an unfeasible status, right?
Yeah.
And there's no real getting away from that. I've worked on projects all over this country, despite the fact that in certain areas people think, oh, well, these guys have got tons of money or whatever. It's never the case.
Yeah.
Funding is always in short supply. There are always more projects than dollars to go round.
Mm-hmm.
We're always trying to figure out how to prioritize our dollars to go to the most needy projects.
Yeah. Given this last federal administration transition,
Mm-hmm.
and that's at a federal scale, but even at a city scale, you see transition of mayors quite often. You see transition
Yep.
of governors and other types of administration that impact resources for projects. How are you advising projects that have to survive multiple political transitions when a political champion is key?
Yeah, that's a great question. And quite honestly, that event or multiple events can pose significant risks to projects. We see it all the time. And whether it be a mayor or a governor or whoever, who is the champion, and it normally has to be someone at that level, right, with enough clout. Political champions need to be able to advocate for the project at all levels, right? I think it comes down to fundamentals, and the fundamentals are you need to be able to show that the project is worth doing. You need to show that it's not someone's sort of passion project, it's
Mm-hmm.
a public good that is got a demonstrable financial feasibility to it, that it can be delivered in the right way, that the risks associated with delivery and operation are not too high, that it's affordable, right? And that ultimately the benefits outweigh the costs. And sometimes we get, I mean, we've seen it so many times where costs start to outweigh benefits. When you see cost escalation, but benefits are static, then what necessarily is the outcome of that is that costs erode benefits. And if they erode them too much, then you have to be frank and honest and say, it was a good project, but it's no longer a good project. And maybe we should deploy our resources somewhere else. So in an effort to avoid that, you need to continuously check the project and convey the benefits. And you need to communicate that, and you need to continuously get stakeholder buy-in and support. Yeah. And that is the way to insulate a project from political change, which is inevitable.
Thanks for tuning in to Building Better Cities. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to hit subscribe so you never miss another episode. And if you could help spread the word by sharing with someone, it would mean so much to us. To learn more about our work, check out buildingbettercities.com. We're excited to keep the conversation going. So until next time, let's keep building better cities together.